Well, good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second in our webinars on slips and trips. These have been covering the work that we've been doing with the Health and Safety Laboratory about preventing slips and trips in historic properties. This webinar today builds on the first webinar where we introduced the work that we've been doing in collaboration with HSL. And hopefully it will give you further, more detailed information that will help you work with your customers to share this insight with them and help them prevent slips and trips in the future. So in detail, what we'd like to cover off today is a reminder of the project and what it was about, the slips and trip causation models that we've been working to, and particularly today we want to focus on the risk factors associated with people. And we can share a little bit more of what we've learned as part of the project in relation to that particular risk factor, share some simple examples of some of the simple precautions that people have adopted, and give you an overview of what we're doing to promote the work moving forward. So just looking at the next slide about the project, why are we still talking about slips and trips in this modern day? Well, from our point of view, slips and trips are still one of our largest causes of loss from a casualty point of view. And as you can see there, about 37% of claims relate to employer's liability, with a further 39% attaching to public liability exposure. So quite a significant attritional loss for us, with the average claim costing somewhere in the region of about £27,000. So from our point of view, looking at the losses that we experience on our casualty account, slips and trips are still the largest attritional loss that we see, which is why that is essentially what prompted us to look to provide some support for customers in relation to preventing slips and trips in historic premises. And that's really what this project was about. We were looking to identify best practice and identify simple solutions, simple precautions that organisations could adopt to prevent slips and trips in these environments. Now, they present quite a number of challenges, historic premises. Essentially, this is because of the design constraints of the fabric of the building. It's design constraints of the building or the fabric of the building itself. But we didn't want to look at this alone. We actually were seeking to partner with leading experts in this field, which is why we teamed up with the Health and Safety Laboratory. The Health and Safety Laboratory is the world's leading provider of health and safety solutions in the UK. It is essentially the research arm of the Health and Safety Executive. So effectively, we've been working with the regulator in this area. They have helped develop the guidance and standards that are applied in terms of managing slips and trips and preventing them in workplaces in the UK, which is used by the regulator. So it was a good fit with us, and we were very pleased to team up with them as part of this project, using their expertise and resources available to them to investigate the particular challenges that historic premises present. You can see their laboratory there in the bottom left-hand photograph. This is the main central laboratory that they have, based in Buxton in Derbyshire, covering about 800 acres of land up there, where they carry out all sorts of research. But we teamed up with the slip and trip unit, which has approximately 40 years experience in this particular area. So good expertise indeed. In terms of historic premises, obviously the nature of the surfaces that are encountered can present some significant challenges, as we can see here in this photograph, where we've got some raised cobbles here. And obviously these would present particular challenges to visitors who may be frail or elderly or less abled. But because of the nature of the historic premises, simply removing these as a feature would not be practicable. And as a consequence of that, trying to identify some practical solutions to deal with this was the scope of the project and what we were trying to aim to get to. And In many historic premises, as we can see in this photograph here, there are a range of surfaces and hazards that can be presented to visitors and employees alike in terms of the premises that they're either visiting or working in. And we can see a range of hazards in this particular photograph with curbing. We've even got rails in this particular photograph, which was one of the locations that we looked at. And as I said, these can present access challenges more generally to visitors and employees alike. So these are the typical sort of situations that we see in historic premises, challenging surfaces and the like, and trying to understand how people use and interact with the building is really critically important. And this is recognised in the causation models that have been put forward by the Health and Safety Executive. You can see these now shown to the right of this slide. One deals with slips, which is the top image there, or graphic, which deals with the risk factors associated with slipping. And we've got an additional graphic in the bottom right of this slide, which highlights the key risk factors associated with tripping. So it's the realization that there could be, in many cases, where a slip or trip actually occurs, it could be attributable to a range of factors in terms of causation. And these models have been developed by the Health and Safety Executive. You can view them at their website. The address is shown in the bottom left of this particular slide. And as I say, these articulate the risk factors associated with slipping and tripping. Today, I wanted to look a little bit more closely at two of those risk factors, and particularly around slips, although this might apply equally from a trip point of view. And that was the way people interact with premises. So people as a risk factor, and the footwear that they wear, which can contribute to any slip or trip accident. The nature of the footwear that is provided can contribute to a slip or a trip accident. So when a person needs more grip to walk than is offered by the floor and their footwear, they will generally slip. So that is the sort of science that sits behind this particular slide. And human behaviour and individual capability will influence how likely they are to slip. So their ability to identify a particular hazard and then their capability of avoiding that hazard and the way that they actually behave in a particular given circumstances will influence quite significantly the likelihood that they will slip or trip when presented with a particular hazard. And as I said, the other feature is footwear. Wearing appropriate slip-resistant footwear does dramatically reduce the risk of slipping, even when walking on challenging surfaces, such as smooth, wet surfaces, wet floors, and the like. So these are sort of critical risk factors, but historic premises generally can challenge the precautions that would normally be associated with these particular risk factors. And I wanted to explore a little bit more in terms of these risk factors as we move through the presentation. So looking at the people aspect, when people slip over, because people are actually involved in the accident, it's easy to conclude that they're entirely due down to their mistake. So essentially human error. But as I said, their ability, their individual capability, and the way that they're actually behaving at the time can influence quite significantly whether they would slip over given a particular circumstances. And those errors are often more likely or compounded by the environment that they're in. So is the floor surface itself more slippery, or are they carrying out a particular task at the time which might make them more vulnerable to slipping? So for an employee, for example, a good example of that might be that they're carrying a box, carrying out some manual handling activity at the time, or the environment. As I said, the environment from a visitor point of view, are they looking up at the features of the building rather than focusing on some of the hazards that might be presented by the particular environment that they're in? So what we typically see in terms of heritage properties is that we've got two groups who are particularly vulnerable. Essentially, the first group of visitors. So that includes contractors and any others coming onto the premises. So they could be particularly at risk given a particular circumstances. And also you've got employees working there and any volunteers that are supporting them in operating the premises. So we've got a number of groups who are particularly exposed from a slip potential point of view. But as I said right at the start of the presentation, historic premises themselves can challenge the typical precautions that you might employ in, say, a factory or on a construction site. For example, many historic premises are actually open to the public, and we would want to support that moving forward. In many instances, they are the lifeblood of generating revenue for those particular premises. But the nature of visitors in themselves, when you open the doors to the public, is that the groups can be quite diverse. And this is unusual in that if you were operating in a factory, you would be able to control the visitors to the site to a greater degree. In historic properties, you've got a diverse range, so you've got a mixed ability. There may be individuals who are less able than others. They may have challenges around visual acuity or something of that nature. And very frequently, you might have an older demographic where you've got the elderly or the frail coming onto premises. They may be more susceptible when confronted with a particular slip hazard or a trip hazard. The other challenge is when it comes to looking at staff, which are thrown up by historic properties, is that frequently volunteers and members of staff are working in the back of house areas. Because of the physical constraints of the building, these can offer up challenging features in steps and stairs and the like. And as a consequence of that, because of the nature of the work that they may be doing, as I mentioned earlier, they may be lifting, carrying, those sorts of activities can make them more vulnerable to a slip or a trip, particularly if the premises are presenting challenging features, particularly in the back of house areas. And as I said, in terms of protecting employees, if you are an employer, thinking about the volunteers that you have supporting you as well is also of critical importance. Now, frequently volunteers may be less familiar with the premises themselves. They may be less familiar with the challenges that they present. They may be more focused on the activities in hand rather than thinking about some of the slip and trip hazards that might be present in those particular premises. The other thing that we realised as part of the research was that a lot of historic properties are diversifying the use of their premises to generate revenue. So a lot are hosting special events which are attracting larger crowds. Obviously, the increased footfall may make slip and trip hazards more risky given the nature of that footfall, the levels of footfall and the ability of the people that sits within that demographic. So you might have large crowds. There may be unusual opening hours, so you may be hosting a ghost tour walk or something of that nature to attract more visitors to a particular revenue, but because you're hosting it during the evening or at night, slip and trip hazards might not be as well recognised or more visual in terms of their appearance, which can present challenge. Bringing in attractions themselves, so a good example here is fairground rides, bouncy castles, those sorts of things. Bringing those onto site in their own right can present a number of trip hazards or slip hazards, depending on the attraction itself. The last issue, of course, a lot of these events will involve serving alcohol, and of course impairment as a consequence of consuming alcohol can actually contribute to the potential for slip and trip accidents at historic premises. So we've got quite diverse properties when we talk about historic properties. We've got these, many of them are open to large numbers of visitors, which bring challenges in their own right. And because of the nature of those premises themselves, they can present challenging features to the staff who work there and the volunteers who are providing support to them. So how can we deal with this in a historic environment, given that we may not be in a situation where we can introduce precautions which will damage or impair the aesthetic, the historic aesthetic of the building itself. Well, one of the key things that we put forward in the material, the guidance material that we prepared in collaboration with the HSL, is a critical thing is to review the visitor journey. This is the way that people move about and use the premises. Reviewing this in some detail will help identify the hazards that exist. They'll also identify the way in which people experience and use the premises themselves, and it will also help understand their behaviour whilst they're on the premises. So this is a really good first step in terms of understanding not just where the slip and trip hazards might be, but also when you introduce a number of visitors to the premises and how their behaviour influences the way that they may come across those hazards and they may deal with them. Obviously, the second point here is to make the premises as safe as possible. Now, again, we saw numerous examples of where organisations had done this, but in many cases, it may not be possible or practical to do that. So we need to think of other ways of dealing with this. One option may be to exclude public access, but we would advocate that only as a last resort, because we want people to enjoy the properties, the premises themselves, enjoy the heritage features of those premises to the fullness of their ability. Where you're doing that, we would obviously advocate the use of a physical barrier rather than a warning sign. Physical barriers are much more visible, and it is quite evident what is trying to be achieved in terms of preventing access. But as we say, preventing access itself is only to be considered as last resort. Some of the examples that we saw when we were out doing the research work was where people were less able to enjoy a particular feature or area in a historic premises. We saw many examples of people using strategies or precautions that would enable those people to enjoy those views or those features. And this could include things like video presentations, short video presentations and the like. So there were lots of good features that we saw, which I'll come on to in a little while, in terms of what people were doing around providing alternative ways for people with restricted mobility to view areas with difficult access. Another good feature that we saw was if we had staff at particular points, is providing training and information to them about specific features in the property which might present a slip and a trip hazard. So they were in a position to offer practical guidance and advice, and in some cases assistance to people using the premises. Another good precaution was actually providing visitor information on warning of challenging areas and any access issues that were associated with that. I'll explore these points in a little while as we move through the presentation. The last bit really is actually, once some precautions are in, we saw some very good evidence of people actually monitoring how people access the premises and looking for ways that people were using those premises which had not originally been thought about. So were they taking shortcuts or desire lines really that were evident in the landscape where people were not following a designated route or something of that nature. The last element of this was in terms of protecting employees, volunteers, members of staff, is when assigning tasks to them is providing them with training and information about the slip and trip hazards that might be present at the particular location. So some good examples that we saw in terms of making access as safe as possible. This is a really good feature that we saw at one of the premises we visited. Very even surfaces, very level, fantastic sort of walkway into the particular premises, quite a high footfall in this particular instance. But we saw examples where the footpaths themselves were challenging in their own right. But in this particular example, the organisation concerned had taken extensive precautions. In this case, they had barriered off the area, and we're providing advice to visitors about the condition of the footpath, nice physical barriers preventing access into those particular areas. And one of the other features that we saw, this is really about nudging behaviour, and we talked a little bit about people using the premises and finding their own ways around those premises. This is just a simple case of actually cutting the grass to nudge behaviour, to influence the way that people would walk about and use those particular premises. So a little bit of a nudge going on in terms of that. So in terms of influencing behaviour and looking at the people risk factor, there's some precautions that we identified there, and they're explored more fully in the guidance that we provided. I'll talk a little bit more about how that can be accessed at the end of the presentation. But we also mentioned that another good way of preventing slips was providing slip-resistant footwear for employees. Now, obviously, footwear is just one factor that contributes to a slip. We saw that in the model, the causation model that we looked at. We'll be exploring other risk factors in the webinars that are coming up later in the year. And obviously, wearing appropriate slip-resistant footwear will significantly reduce the risk of slipping. But obviously, from a historic property point of view, a large proportion of the people visiting those premises will be members of the public. So providing them with suitable footwear is simply not an option. So how do we actually deal with that? Well, we'll consider that a little bit more depth shortly. We also saw that another challenge that historic properties frequently throw up is that staff are less likely to work in high-risk areas for long periods of time. So then it becomes a balance between providing appropriate slip-resistant footwear so that that's cost-effective. And sometimes the last point here, they may be, from a conservation point of view, be required to wear disposable plastic shoe covers when entering delicate areas. So there were a number of features and challenges that we saw in terms of historic premises, which could actually just challenge this issue of issuing footwear as you probably would do in a more commercial premise, such as a factory or a construction site. And if we didn't think that a high-risk slip environments existed in heritage premises, here's a great example that we saw. Obviously, as a consequence of diversification, here's a cafeteria that had been set up with the potential for slips and trips. Some really good features in terms of what was being done in this particular location. They provided their staff with adequate footwear, but in terms of more generally from a visitor point of view, with frequent checks and cleaning in the front of house in terms of the cafe areas, and obviously spill procedures to deal with any spillages that occurred in normal usage. So these premises do exist, and obviously in some environments providing appropriate footwear might be appropriate. If there is a possibility of providing footwear, then obviously identifying the tasks where that's appropriate is critical. If providing footwear, then obviously what HSL were putting forward as part of the guidance that we've developed is that selection of that was based on their grip scheme. So this looks at slip resistance of various footwear and grades them, and that can be accessed on the website. So using that as a tool to make sure that you've got the right slip resistant footwear for a particular circumstance is very important. Obviously, training is key for staff, knowing when to use the footwear, how they report defects with it, how they look after it, how they store it, and those sorts of things. And then just the normal precautions that you might adopt in terms of providing this footwear as a precaution, monitoring effectiveness, seeing how it's used by your staff, and where slip-resistant footwear is impracticable, is considering the use of slip-resistant overshoes, as we mentioned. For staff, where this is a particular issue, then it seems more straightforward and the precautions are quite simple in many respects. For visitors, it's more challenging. So we would put forward a number of solutions in this case, some of which are quite simple and straightforward. So simply, as I mentioned earlier, positioning staff so that they can offer guidance and assistance where particular hazards exist is a really good precaution for that. In many circumstances, you can make a feature of that where there is a historic element of the building, say a step which is out of proportion, which has a historic resonance. You can make a feature of that as part of that, but obviously pointing out that it is a particular hazard in those particular circumstances. And the other thing that we were advocating was providing accessible information for visitors. So in terms of the information, what could be provided? We saw a number of channels with the sites that we visited were providing good health and safety information about access to their location. They were talking about the conditions of the footpaths, where one particular environment might present a more significant hazard than another, or where there were difficulties in terms of accessing particular locations, so up steep stairs, or where the stairs were particularly particularly worn, and obviously providing detail of what alternative means of access were available. We saw numerous examples of this. We also saw some good examples where hazards which may be unusual were made a feature of, or were pointed out in the information that was provided to visitors. And in some instances, particularly with large estates, there was advice and guidance provided to visitors about typically the sorts of footwear which would be advisable to deal with the location itself. We saw all this information provided in a very simply a number of channels, as I said, at the point of sale, particularly where tickets were booked online, at the access point to the location itself, in general visitor information, posting information on a website as part of attraction leaflets, and in audio guides, and providing information in safety signs. But obviously providing safety signs is probably one of the last most effective means of providing information for visitors on slip and trip hazards. The reason for this is that, as you can see in the top left hand of this slide, obviously just posting a sign doesn't remove the hazard itself. It can easily be ignored by people, and if there are frequent visitors or staff using the premises more frequently, they may simply get used to them. And the final point here is about how that information is actually provided. So obviously the health and safety legislation that deals with safety signs is very prescriptive in terms of the standards that need to be adhered to in terms of providing those. And it's a sensible measure, if a sign is considered necessary, that it would adopt those principles, but obviously in an empathetic way, which is sympathetic with the historic aesthetic of the building itself. As I said, using only signs where all of the precautions have been explored. We would advocate, if signs are being used, they have a clear and simple message, and that they're positioned so that they clearly relate to hazards that have been identified. One of the things that we did, or HSE were keen to stress as part of this research, is that where slippery floor surfaces cleaning signs are actually posted, is that they're removed pretty much after the floor itself has become dry, because we've had a number of instances where people have actually tripped over them themselves. So there's lots of good examples of this, and here's an example that we saw at one location. They physically locked the gates and the access, and they've gone one step further in terms of providing a sign there. So in terms of what we've done as a result of this project, we've looked at the causation models. So today we've been looking at footwear and people, and actually we've looked at all the risk factors that are associated with causation from a slip and trip point of view, and we've developed simple guidance which can be used by customers and by you as brokers to enable or to help customers manage the risk from slips and trips. There's a little bit of an introduction about why this is a particular risk feature, so in this case why footwear is a problem, why people may present the characteristics of people which might accentuate hazards in a particular environment. And then we explore some of the challenges that are presented by historic properties, with a number of the solutions being outlined. So we've got each of those for the risk factors. We've got some more common modules dealing with how the law would apply to historic premises, completing risk assessments in relation to slips and trips, and the final piece of this, when if things do go wrong, what to consider from a defensibility point of view should a claim arise from a slip and trip perspective. So there's quite a range of modules that are there. So a couple of key messages just to finish off today. Historic premises, when it comes to managing slips and trips, can be challenging in themselves. We would advocate a sensible approach to managing those, and adopting precautions which are simple and proportionate. The precautions that can be identified can be sympathetic, and they will match the aesthetic of the premises themselves. And as a consequence of that, hopefully they are straightforward to adopt and cost effective. In terms of the project, this has been a unique research area. I don't think anybody has looked at slips and trips in historic properties before. We've partnered with the HSL, a world leader in this particular area, to put up this guidance. We've looked at it from a prevention through to a defensibility point of view, and it's been reviewed by colleagues as a consequence. In terms of what we're doing next to promote it, we have updated web pages where all the modular content can be accessed. We're about to embark on a social media campaign with associated press releases, and we have some webinars to look forward to in the latter part of this year, dealing with some of the historic premises, with some of the other risk factors in relation to historic premises. So I'd like to thank you for listening. You can listen to this webinar again on our website. You can also, if you haven't had an opportunity to catch up on the first webinar, through that website as well, which is shown on the email on the website address to the right here. So I'd like to thank you all for listening, and I look forward to speaking to you again in the future. Thanks now. Bye.